Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming back so promptly for this main panel session. The plan is we're going to have 4 presentations straight after, one after the other. And then even during those presentations, if you could think there'll be many things you want to ask. And so the idea is that we set aside a full 10 minutes for conversation at the end of the panel session, where you can ask one or more of the panelists something that's maybe either arisen from their presentation or something that you're burning to ask. So I really want to start very quickly and talk about the first presentation, and that will be delivered by Maureen Mallon, the Assistant Director, Children and Families Education Scotland. Please welcome her to talk about building the ambition.
Good afternoon, everybody. First up, just a quick couple of things about Education Scotland. I'm pretty sure everybody knows who we are, but you should never make these assumptions, should you? So we're an improvement agency. I think that makes us pretty unique, or at least very unusual in the world. So for those of our international people, I thought it would be better to just explain us slightly. We're a combination of an improvement agency and an agency for inspection and scrutiny. The emphasis is very much on improvement, and we think of all of our work on inspection and scrutiny as being interrelated, and I'm sure Henry's going to come on to that. We use all of our information to support and influence policy development and advise ministers, as well as to support improvement in the sector. Anybody wants to talk about that later, Shan and I are both here for the rest of the day. So let's jump on to building the ambition, and I'll tell you what I'm going to cover. First thing I need to do is make sure I'm owning up to the fact that Building the Ambition is not an Education Scotland programme, not by any manner of means. The guidance was published by Scottish Government, but it is our role as the improvement agency to support this implementation and to really get into the detail of how people should be using it. So we worked very closely with Scottish Government and other colleagues in the development of the guidance, and to really to think about how to put theory into practice, offering a lot of case studies. It offers a lot of reflective questions. I'm sure most of you have already used it. Is it embarrassing to ask an opposite hands up? Anybody not familiar with Building the Ambition? Oh, phew, that makes life a lot easier. Good. Right, in that case, I'm going to jump very swiftly on. I'm such a geeky inspector, never make any assumptions about these things. So what I want to do is very quickly talk to you about the story so far in terms of how we've been supporting the implementation, and to also talk about our future developments. I thought people would be keen to hear about how good is our early learning and childcare and where we're going with that, so we'll quickly move into that because it's very much about supporting, and it is actually here because of Building the Ambition and the new guidance. Very quick, because I'm very aware that I'm about to get a 2-minute thing just in probably about 6 minutes. Time moves fast. So, it's very obviously available. You've all got hard copies, and we know people got really excited about hard copies. I want to give you a bit of a caveat and say increasingly Education Scotland are going to deliver almost exclusively digitally. And happy to have a lot of conversation with you around that, but we really feel that that's the way we have to go. Every time we give you something in hard copy, it's out of date as I'm handing it to you. That's a real frustration all round, and I think we have to have a lot of debate and discussion about how we're going to move this way. So we've done an awful lot of work in terms of rolling out the Building the Ambition activities with Scottish Government colleagues. We went out to the 32 local authorities and really listened an awful lot. And I suppose that's one of the big messages we want to say. We're constantly listening. It's very, very dangerous when you sit at the centre to make assumptions that you know what's going on. So we're all about listening and really understanding what's going on. So we ran training sessions across the country, and we've built trainers into each local authority. Lots of people came along, and a bit like today, we were overwhelmed with the response that we had for those sessions. We've been developing support materials, and again, I just want to show you some of those rather than just talk about them, because I think a lot of people aren't using them because they're maybe a bit overwhelmed by what's in there. Again, can I do a really rough hands up of if people started exploring the support materials that are out there? Hand up if you have been. Not bad, about half, that's pretty good. What I want to do is just to discuss what we're doing with that. Again, not developing them only from the centre. My colleagues have all been working really hard to come out and engage with people about developing these materials. How do we actually develop something that's useful and tangible for you? How do we develop something that's chunky enough to be usable and not overwhelming? So following the good practice that was in building the ambition and keeping that momentum going. So let's have a quick look at one of the sessions, just to talk you through that. And if any of you actually here contributed to that development, can I say a big thanks to you, because I'm not really sure who did on all the various ones.
How long is this?
Oh, I'm not going to actually show the material. Can you see?
No.
Oh, I think it would be helpful, yeah, because I think it's quite nice if you can see.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And because I got to do the learned behaviour base earlier, I won't be scared when the lights go down on me there. So here we are. When you go into them, the sessions all tell you what's in there, what to do, what the focus is, how to prep, and how to use the specific parts of building the ambition to do that. You go in and you'll find leaders' notes, and this is all open and accessible, not secret leaders' notes for the secret people. Everybody should read all of these things to understand, if you are actually participating in the sessions, what the leaders are actually going to do to get you through this. It's all about encouraging dialogue. I think a lot of us are already discovering that everybody's got most of the answers out there. It's about a consistency and a trust and an honesty about how to take all of this forward. So leaders' notes are there. And then the participant activity, taking you through and taking you to a specific part of building the ambition, saying, read this, and then we're going to use this for the conversation. Pretty obvious. Activities in there, talking you through what you need to do about thinking about, really deep thinking about your understanding. And these are very small components that we're looking at each time. And we're doing that because in the big discussions that we had, people were saying, that's lovely. And we got a bit worried that people were saying, that's lovely, I really understand that. And you think, I'm a bit scared about that. I'd like to actually get into the tiny little bits of this and make sure we're thinking about it quite deeply. So various activities there, asking people to think generally and then to think about their own setting. In some ways, very similar to the messaging that we were getting earlier, which is quite reassuring, isn't it? Various other activities in here, thinking about what works well in your own settings and so on. And we've been building in some photographs and so on. People can insert their own or whatever, but we think it's good to have some standard information in there. So that's what we have in terms of the support materials. We've got quite a lot there. We've got a lot more coming. So keep an eye on the website. What I want to do in the last 2 minutes is to quickly tell you about how good is our early learning and childcare. A new framework coming through because we have new statutory guidance coming through and people need to understand how to self-evaluate within that new construct. It's difficult at the moment to say that self-evaluation is going well. It's not. It's the biggest thing that comes up for us is people actually really deeply understanding their practice. So we're going out and saying, how do we really need to work very closely with people in developing this? It's very closely aligned to the recently published How Good Is Our School, which went live last week. This won't go live until really into early next year, but there's a lot of dialogue already. We're out talking to the ADES colleagues, we're talking to all sorts of colleagues, we're talking to our national partners, and we will open this up for conversation. This won't be anything that we'll publish and then say that's a set piece. This will forever adapt and change because we're going to be in an ever-changing society. So we really need to think about that very quickly. It's chunked into 15 indicators rather than the 39. And what we're going to try very hard is to make sure that what people don't do is to jump into thinking, what are the inspectors really looking at? So we're only really going to look at the 5 that the inspectors look at. We can't have that anymore. People really need to get into the heart of thinking about this properly as a self-evaluation tool. So covering learning provision, covering leadership and management, and covering successes and achievements. When we put that online, there'll be a lot of open dialogue, an awful lot of opportunity, and we're looking for enthusiastic converts very early. So if you do want to talk to us about that early, please do. The last punt I want to make is to say to you that we yesterday published some additional inspection advice online, and I would urge you to go and look at that. It's a terribly named thing. We call it inspection advice, and actually it's not only for inspection, it's really useful generic advice for how to deeply self-evaluate. So we should, oh gosh, please, if I could change it. I have these debates and arguments all the livelong day in my organisation. They're sick of the sight of me. They see me coming in and think, She's the moany person. No, I'm only the boss of this component, but I am very grumpy in the corporate leadership team, but they tell me they love me anyway. So if you all tell me that we should change it, it would be incredibly helpful.
You want to change?
See what we can do.
Welcome Catherine Chisholm, the Early Learning and Childcare Team, Children and Families Director from the Scottish Government. The Workforce Review from Catherine Chisholm. Thanks very much indeed. Now you want to...
Is it just scroll on, sorry?
At the back, is it any better for you guys, or do you want it lowered still? It's a difficult thing because we do want to see our speaker. Are you going to quite a lot on the screen?
There's a number of slides,
so we'll take the lights
so
down
probably be helpful, yeah. Sorry about this. Here we go. Thanks, Jane. So onwards, yes. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about the Early Learning and Out-of-School Care Workforce Review, the report of which was published in June of this year. This was an independent review which was commissioned by Scottish Government and chaired by Professor Iram Siraj, who's a leading expert in early education, I'm sure be familiar to many of you. If I could just say something to start about the rationale for us commissioning this review. The last national review, of course, was in 2006, which was a major review which gave birth to the BA in Childhood Practice in particular, which is a fantastic and innovative qualification. However, the time had, in the sort of intervening years since then, there's been a number of developments at the policy and research level in relation to sort of early years. And the notion of early intervention and the absolute, primacy of that, I think, had just exploded a lot since 2006, and that sort of brought into focus the key role that those working within early learning and childcare and out-of-school care can play in the lives of children. We've heard a lot about that already today. And the time was thought to be right as well. Since 2006, we've had an expansion in the funded early learning and childcare hours from 412.5, I think it was, back in 2006 to 475 hours per year in 2007, and then last year's expansion to 600 hours. And we also have the context of thinking around how to expand further. At that time, there was a commitment in the white paper, Scotland's Future, and subsequent to then, we've agreed upon this 30 hours expansion for 3 and 4-year-olds and eligible twos. So they just felt that the time was right, really, to look again at what qualities and skills and expertise we need of those working with the youngest children to produce the best outcomes. If we just say something quickly about the process, we appointed Professor Siraj in April 2014. She was absolutely clear that she wanted it to be a consultative and collaborative process. She established an expert group, as the Minister mentioned earlier, with cross-sectoral representation. She was clear that she wanted some formal consultation to inform the review, as well as the research from international and from Scotland that would inform the report. She was also clear there would be discussion of the draft report with the expert group, and that the whole process would be quite transparent and based on consultation. The report, as I said, was published in June of this year. In terms of how Iram went around consulting and gathering data, this consisted of her meeting with every representative of the expert group one-to-one and meeting others that were proposed by those members. She also undertook a range of visits to all the different types of early learning and childcare and out-of-school care settings during the course of a number of visits to Scotland during the year she conducted the review. And she also undertook focus groups with practitioners from the early learning and out-of-school care workforces, with childminders and with training providers of all the qualifications, as well as teachers, I should say. The formal consultation aspect was conducted via the Scottish Government Consultation Hub. She wanted to have two, one for organisations and one to attract the views of individual practitioners. She felt very strongly that this was important, rightly so. We had a fantastic response, and I think I can safely say that Iram was overwhelmed by the extent of the responses that she received. If I can put it in context, you see there's 84 organisation, 269 individual. For the Children and Young People Bill, which is obviously a massive piece of landmark legislation, there were 300 responses. So I thought it was fantastic that for this single report there was such a high volume, particularly from the practitioners that are the lifeblood of the sector, really. So that was a really good response. The report, upon publication, has stressed, as the Minister pointed out during her speech, that really we're starting from a point of strength with the workforce in Scotland. And I think the fact that 300 people have given up their Saturday to come here today is testament to that, absolutely. And there could have been many more, from what I hear. I'm recognised in the report a high quality of provision and passion and genuine commitment and love for children across the workforces in Scotland. And she also particularly noted the feeling in Scotland around commitment to children's rights, and that underpinned services, the child at the centre, if you like, and then that primacy she particularly noticed was prevalent in Scotland. The report did identify a number of challenges. That was, part of what Iran was brought in to look at, so that's only right. As the Minister mentioned in her speech, the main challenge that we're facing going forward is how do we maintain quality, build upon the quality we already have as we move to expand access to early learning and childcare. Iran was very clear that the best team is a mixed team. So there's a lot in the report about ensuring the right mix of skills within settings to make sure that children's learning and development and nurture are all supported. So that's another key challenge. And she also identified that improving the status of the profession was absolutely critical. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. It's an absolutely incredible profession. I definitely do not have time to outline 31 recommendations, so I will not attempt to do so in the time that I have today. I've just set out here a number of sort of key themes that I think emerged from the review. Iran was clear that there must be a strategic commitment at national level that transcended electoral cycles to the quality agenda, and stressed that any expansion must have this at its heart. She mentioned that it was important to be able to assess how well children were developing and to have a sense of the impact that early learning and childcare was having on the children in this 0 to 6 age range. She talked a lot about improving the evidence base on what works and how early learning and childcare and out-of-school care can contribute to improved outcomes for children. She particularly highlighted perhaps a particular need for more research on childminders and out-of-school care as perhaps areas that aren't as well understood in terms of the benefits. She also talked a lot about the content of the existing suites of qualifications, and that goes for teachers, the childhood practitioners, all the grades working within early learning and childcare, just to make sure that we have what we need to ensure quality, and we look at whether any other kinds of qualifications might be beneficial. So those are all aspects that, and status and pay, absolutely critical, as the Minister highlighted earlier. It's an independent review, as I've stressed, so the Scottish Government is carefully considering all of the recommendations at the present time. We have already held a meeting of the expert group after the report was published to have initial discussions about the recommendations. We've also heard a series of bilaterals with individual members and others over the summer to discuss the recommendations and how we might respond. We're meeting again with the expert group next week, and they will have an opportunity to share some of the early thinking with their networks further on from that, and we will seek to publish a response later in the year. We have resources to allocate to any implementation work arising from the review, and we'll carefully consider what should be prioritised there together with the group. I know I don't have much time, and I know that we've already spoken about the longer-term commitments to expand in early learning and childcare, so I just wanted here to stress that quality will be at the heart of this expansion and that we are aware of the considerable challenge faced. If I could just finish, I'd like to go back to the idea of building on the strong foundation. This quote is from Iram's personal concluding comments from the report, and I thought it was, a nice thing to finish on, talking about the progress Scotland has made, and that is an absolute foundation on which to build. So, there's a slight typo in my name there, sorry. If anyone wishes to discuss anything to do with the review further, I will be doing a World Cafe session later on where we'll discuss a specific recommendation within the review. But I'm very happy to speak to anyone in the course of today, or you can contact me thereafter. Chisholm's actually got an H, but apart from that, if you take down the contact details, I'll be very happy to discuss anything to do with the presentation and the review.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm really sorry that you've been sent into some kind of twilight zone. But it's either going to be you see the screen or you see the speaker. I'm very conscious of the fact that those of you at the back will never see the size of the writing on the screen, whether you're using reading specs or not. So I assume that absolutely everything that's being discussed this morning will be online. Am I right? Yes, so if you're not picking up stuff, then indeed it will be online. So without any more ado, I'd like to introduce Heather Douglas, the Early Years Manager at Glasgow City Council, who's going to be talking specifically about working with 2-year-olds and nurture.
Thank you, and hello everybody, and hello again for those of you who come to this conference annually. I feel slightly, goodness me, you must be thinking, God, her again. But thank you so much to Jean for inviting me again to tell you about what's happening in Glasgow. I've got another 2 thank yous to say just before I start, really quickly. The second thank you is to my 13-year-old daughter, Rowan, because can I tell you, I wrote the words, the slides are all her work, so fingers crossed they work. And the final thank you is to my mother and to Maria. To my mother because instinctively, intuitively, the kind of person I am is the person that says, there's always a solution. Whatever the problem is, there's a solution. You know, and my heart doesn't go down into the depths. But thank you, Maria, because I now have a name for that feeling. Whappa! The next time something goes wrong in the office, which will probably be Monday, whappa! There's a solution. We can sort this. I'm going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of Glasgow's kind of 2-year-old journey, where we're at in it, a bit of the history, not much of the history, but a bit of the history, where we're at in it just now, how we're trying to bring it all together, and some of the challenges that we're facing. Glasgow's got a long history of 2-year-olds. We've had 2-year-old places in our daycare nurseries, in our family centres for decades, actually, you know, probably going back to the 70s and 80s. But when it really started to grow and really started to take off was in 2006. 2006, Scottish Government then, at that time, launched the Vulnerable Twos pilot. Some of you will remember that. There were 3 or 4 local authorities who were given a bit of extra funding to really focus in on expanding what we could do for vulnerable 2-year-olds. It was a 2-year pilot, and the money ended in 2008. But Glasgow took the decision that it was so important, that working with this age group was so fundamentally important, particularly in addressing inequalities and disadvantage, that we not only maintained every single place that had been created on top of what we already had as a result of that pilot, we've actually continued to grow our 2-year-old provision. So we're in quite a fortunate position in Glasgow compared to some of my local authority colleagues. We have 1,000 nursery places in council nurseries for children aged 2 to 3. Do we have enough? Maybe not when you start to look at the expanding agenda. But on top of that, we've been thinking constantly about improving outcomes. We've had the changes in legislation. The Children and Young People's Act was groundbreaking legislation, really. You know, thinking about how we deal with families and children in the round, how we GIRFIC our families. I actually hate that. I hate GIRFIC. I wish we could think of another thing to call it. There's something about the name that just doesn't work for me. But it's about thinking about how do we get the best outcomes for children and families together. And that's absolutely connected to what we do with our very youngest children. Change in legislation I've mentioned. However, it's also about economic regeneration, and that was what I was trying to get to in terms of my question that I asked the Minister there, because I think there's a fundamental tension between some of what we're trying to do around addressing poverty and getting families out of poverty, which in Glasgow is a massive issue. 1/3 of our children live in poverty. 36,000 children in this city are living in poverty. But how do we do that at the same time as focusing on good quality child development, which fundamentally must happen with the parent in the home learning environment as well as in the group care environment, if the parent's out working all the time? It's a real tricky one to kind of balance. Add into that changes in the welfare system. We know that the next thing that's coming is when your youngest child turns 3, single parents having to look for work. You know, you can begin to see, well, how much of this agenda is about childcare for working parents and how much of it is about children. And the trick is going to be to balance the two so that actually we can achieve that massive aspiration, that making Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. This is a slightly boring bit now. This is the legislation bit. Sorry, Catherine. I'm not going to labour this. If you haven't read the statutory guidance, Part 6 of the Act, the Early Learning and Childcare Guidance, you have to get hold of that, guys. You have to read it, because that is the driver. Maureen referenced that in terms of the work that we're doing, that's been done around the Early Learning and Childcare Framework. This is a really important document, because that is the kind of implementation driver. That's a document that is beginning to describe the how. And I deliberately say beginning, because, oh boy, it's a massive journey. We've got the increased entitlement, so it's all 3 and 4-year-olds and some 2-year-olds now have an entitlement. That's a legal entitlement enshrined in law. 2-year-olds who are looked after, 2-year-olds in kinship care, 2-year-olds with parent or court-appointed guardians, and the new bit, 2-year-olds whose families meet the free school meal criteria. Now, that all sounds fab. You think, yeah, what's not to like? Free universal childcare, great idea. And it is a great idea. It's a great idea at the kind of broad level. It has some impact in terms of the implementation, though. Glasgow historically always prioritised looked after children, always prioritised vulnerable children in terms of, those in kinship care. We always prioritised struggling families financially. But there's been a subtle change to our policy, because previously we prioritised vulnerable children in terms of those who were looked after, and then our next priority was children living in low-income working families. A shift to prioritisation of families who meet the free school meal criteria puts the prioritisation onto out-of-work households. Now, that's great if you've got capacity for everybody, but if you don't have capacity for everybody, which even with our 1,000 places, we may well not have as we begin to fill those places up, what then happens is the low-income working family is pushed further down the priority as the out-of-work family comes in. So we're now saying to parents who would previously have had access to our services, sorry, I know you're struggling to maintain your minimum wage job, but actually your unemployed next-door neighbour is a bigger priority, because that's what it says in the legislation. So it's a difficult balancing act in terms of the delivery of all of this. Oh, arrows. Who knew? Oh, dearie me, I'll have words with that girl when I get home, I'll tell you. So, we are where we are. Don't get me wrong, I do think the move towards universal, free childcare, extended child, I think it's a good thing, but it's the how we do it. So this slide, I hope, is going to be about the implementation. Current challenge. I like that spinny thing. Doubling the numbers. So we've got 1,000 places already. In terms of the estimates that we have, which have actually been provided by Scottish Government really helpfully through the Department of Work and Pensions, we need 2,000 places for 2 to 3s. 1,000 extra places. And we need them now. Except, do we? Because one of the things we're finding as we implement that policy is that actually we've not seen a massive raft of new parents coming forward. We're seeing the parents who always came forward in terms of vulnerable families, low-income families. We don't have hundreds of parents of 2-year-olds knocking on our door and saying, where is my place? But it's in the legislation that they could. So we have to plan, we have to think, we have to prepare and be ready for them coming. There has to be a place to offer them if they want it. The new challenge, 30 hours. Well, I was interested, it was 2021. I thought it was 2020 that we were talking about, so delighted we've got a whole extra year. Oh, phew. This is a massive challenge. Again, hugely aspirational, but we're talking about doubling again. We're not just talking about doubling the number of 2-year-old places. We are talking about doubling the capacity of the entire system. So every 3 and 4-year-old, every 2-year-old, so if I've got 10,000 3 and 4-year-olds in council nurseries at the moment, all getting 16 hours. If they've all to get 30 hours, well, 5,000 of them could have it in the spaces that we've got. What do I do with my other 5,000 children? So you can see, nationally, this kind of doubling and growing the capacity in the system is huge. Major challenges around buildings. Do we have the spaces? Do we have the right environments, particularly for the 2-year-olds, but actually for all of our children under 5? How are we going to do this with partners? Partners have to be part of this. If we're going to achieve this, at a presentation I was at the other day, someone was talking about the art of the possible. I like to think of this as the art of the impossible. But we'll try. We'll see where we get to. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of our partners to be part of this. And we need to be thoughtful about what that looks like. How do you run a private nursery if 30 hours that every child attends is funded at a fixed rate? What does that do to your business? Workforce. Delighted to hear everything that's been said about quality and qualifications and all the rest of it. Actually, I've got a more fundamental question. Where are they coming from? You know, who's going to be our workforce? We only have less than 2% of the workforce are male. You know, where are men in this equation? That's a whole untapped argument around that. But there are serious issues around workforce. You know, particularly if we're talking about quality. How do we attract the best and most able people into this profession when it continues to remain a kind of low-paid, low-prestige profession generally? And I know people don't like to hear that, but we all know it's true. So how do we do that? How do we kind of square that circle? Skill set, particularly around 2-year-olds. They're a different beastie. Those of us that have always worked with children know that. We need to be thinking fundamentally about what those children need and how we need to upskill our staff teams, train new people coming into the profession, and think differently about the type of provision that we're offering. Final slide, I promise. Okay. What we're doing in Glasgow. It's essential that we do not think about this expansion of 2-year-olds and this expansion of childcare hours in isolation. You have to think about it in the round. We have to connect it up with everything. We have our early intervention approach, which I've been here at this conference before talking about, so some of you might remember some of that. That's around how we work with our just coping families to address disadvantage and inequality. We have another strategy. We have Towards a Nurturing City, which is about how we take our really effective nurture work in nurseries and schools and actually expand and grow those principles so that every single service, it's a community planning-led approach, every single service is thinking about children and families within a nurturing context. Underpinning all of that has to be family engagement and family learning. If this is just about childcare, we might as well go home now. It's not going to work. It has to be about how we engage families, how we engage parents in supporting their children's learning, and how we engage parents in their own learning. Because ultimately, that's the key question we have to ask. Do we want more of the same? Is it just about, extra free childcare hours? Or is it actually about transformational change and what we can achieve? Thank you.
And I hope in the 10 minutes for questions we'll talk about buildings, status, where the workforce is going to come from. But before we do that, we welcome our final speaker, who's Henry Matthias, who is Head of Inspection at the Care Inspectorate for inspecting and improving outcomes. And before you come on, do you have slides? Yeah. So, lights down. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much.
Fantastic turnout today. What a great conference. And just to hear that it could be double the number of people. And congratulations for using your initiative. I go into the male toilet and it's full of women. I can tell it's an early years conference. Maybe just say a little bit about myself. I'm head of teams of early years inspectors. I was an inspector many moons ago. This was going back to Care Commission and pre-Care Commission days. The Care Inspectorate is the successor body, the new regulator for early years services. And just looking back at my experience, when I first took the job as an early years inspector, it was pretty top-down stuff. It was very much compliance-based. I had a checklist, and I was going along, and I was checking a whole load of provider inputs. Quite technical stuff. We are shifting. It's a journey that we're on, and we're now looking much more to try to look at the softer side of things, the intangibles. And at the end of the day, isn't that much more important for the welfare, the health, the well-being of children, is some of the softer skills, the quality of the interaction. And you know, that Shinari bit under Gerfic has really helped us focus on outcomes for children. actually what are children experiencing in services? And there are lots of inspections that we did previously under the old model where services came out very well. They were ticked all the boxes on my checklist for provider input. But in terms of the outcomes, there was something missing in terms of the quality, the warmth of the interaction between the adults and the children. And we're trying to assess more the relationships, the quality, the warmth of the care that are being provided in different services. So this model has really helped us. And just taking, Shinari, I'm sure that you've all heard of Shinari. I've not actually come across a child yet called Shinari, but I could see that might be on its way. Just to take, a couple of these indicators. The healthy. Old model, we were fairly obsessed with infection control. That was the main basis of the old school type of inspection. And some people will say we were bordering on kind of nerdy obsession with that. And hopefully you've experienced a bit of a shift so that we're looking much more holistically. There's more that goes into making a healthy, happy child. And say looking at active. We used to very much go along and we would check the equipment. We would look at the outdoor play areas that every single service had. We would make sure that it was safe, that all the right equipment was there. And sometimes it would be empty. And we're much more looking now at actually what are children experiencing. What is the quality of their experience outdoors? And those services that are increasingly going out and exploring the natural environment, we're commenting positively on that. There's been a real sea change in the way that all of us and staff and children are engaging with the natural environment. Absolutely to be welcomed. In terms of the big shift we're in, with all this funding, all this attention going into early years, what an exciting time it is. And just to look at the increase in the number of partners that are going into partnership with local authorities. And interesting to see the voluntary sector particularly increasing. And this bit about the 2-year-olds. They were called vulnerable, now it's more eligible, and should it be entitled, maybe is better. But what a sea change we're having. And the Care Inspectorate is very much looking at the full range of different types of models of care that there are. We've got a really wonderful variety of different types of services. And playgroups, childminders, local authority nurseries, private nurseries, all bring their own strengths. And we're hopefully reflecting that in inspection reports so that childminders can provide that excellent one-to-one care, can provide that home from home. And some children need that, especially at a very young age, that they're not ready to go into a big group, that they need assistance with that. And I would say that Early Years Scotland, Jean and her team have got particular expertise in that younger age range. And just looking back when I became a dad and was engaging with different groups, just what an assistance it was to me individually to be able to go to my local community playgroup, to be welcomed there, and to actually see there's different ways of playing with children. I learned a lot from that experience. The settling in of children, the learning to share, seeing a group of adults working with children, some of whom are parents, absolute strength to that. And what do these 2-year-olds need? And we're looking obviously we've been very busy, registering lots of new services, increasing the number of places. But we're also commenting on the outcomes for children, how children are experiencing going into group care for the first time. And I'm hoping that those of you who have been inspected recently are experiencing a bit of a shift, not just in terms of what the inspector does, us looking much more at outcomes rather than inputs, but also on the essential quality of the interaction, the difference it makes to children. the unique characteristics that you have in your service. This building the ambition that Maureen, Education Scotland, Scottish Government, the Care Inspectorate are very proud of this document. And it's having quite a good impact. We've given a lot of practice examples that I hope will be very useful to you and your staff working directly with children. And it does represent a great opportunity for us to create a much more integrated system. Traditionally, it has been quite divided, depending on whether you work in a private nursery, whether you work in a playgroup, whether you work in a local authority, nursery, or children's centre. And that building the ambition is a very strong support from government to create a much more level playing field, to raise the status, to overcome some of the traditional barriers that we've all experienced. And we're seeing that the new opportunities that we're having with this increased funding is going to change the way that people working in childcare, parents using, but above all, children experience much higher quality. Some of the challenges that we've got, and it's striking to look at the pattern of childcare that we have. So early learning and childcare varies considerably depending on where you live. And currently, half as many childcare services per head of the population are available in the most deprived areas of Scotland. The distribution of playgroups, for instance, shows a similar pattern, with fewer and smaller services in the deprived areas. And then on top of that, when we look at the grading, and we look at the grading across the board for different types of services, the pattern is significant. More deprived area, lower grading. And that's a challenge for all of us, to bring everybody up to that same good quality standard. Don't want to end on a real negative. And it's really important for us to remember that the quality of the services in Scotland is very good. This is from the Care Inspectorate's triennial review. And we're just looking at playgroups just as a slice of that. 57 evaluated as providing very good or excellent care and support. The Growing Up in Scotland research that was conducted by Edinburgh University showed that the grading for care and support that the Care Inspectorate awards actually does have an impact on individual children once you take into account all the family background circumstances, all the other reasons for why children might have better language, better emotional well-being. And taking those factors away, seeing that the quality of the service and your grade for care and support makes a difference to the individual children. And it's worth remembering just that the good quality that we have out there, we want to celebrate that. Thank you very much.